Hello and welcome to part 2 of this special 3-part GradCast episode series where we continue to talk to Western graduate students about how COVID-19 has impacted their research since lockdown in March. In this episode, hosts Elizabeth Mohler and Gavin Tolometti talk with PhD student Yoah Sui and recent postdoctorate Yoah Sui.
All right, you're listening to GradCast. Today we have a special episode. We're talking all things COVID and how that's impacted research. We're really lucky off the top today. Our guest, Yoah Sui, no stranger to GradCast, but Anna has a really exciting project that she's going to talk to us about. So Anna, I'm going to turn it over to you. Give us the lowdown on your project.
Thanks, Liz. So my project actually started before COVID happened, and we were looking at smartphone-related anxiety, specifically in post-secondary students. So we asked a lot of Western students how dependent on their phones they were and how anxious they were if they couldn't reach their phones. In a more nuanced way than that, but that was the gist of it. And then when the lockdown happened, we had this incredible opportunity, this natural experiment where people started using their phones so much more than they were before, because people were ordering food, people were using TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp a lot more. People couldn't go see their friends or family, so they were FaceTiming each other. So we had everyone just using their phones so much more, and we wanted to see how that would impact their smartphone-related anxiety.
You know, it's interesting to me. I'm thinking about my own life since COVID started, and absolutely, my smartphone is never more than about a foot away. And you're right, there's a lot of ordering of Uber Eats or laundry services or groceries, whatever that might be. So tell us a little bit about kind of what some of your anticipated thinkings were or thoughts were around what you were maybe expecting to find given this new world we're in.
So everyone on the project kind of agreed that because everyone was using their phones more, everyone would get like more attached to their phones, and they would be a lot more anxious if they couldn't use their phone, because now they were relying on this device for everything, like you said, for groceries, for socializing, for everything. And so we were like going into this thinking, okay, we know what the data is going to look like. And that wasn't the case at all.
It's interesting. Why, I guess a two-parter here. Why do you think that wasn't the case? And tell us what you actually did find.
So what we did actually find is that there was absolutely no change between smartphone addiction and like smartphone related anxiety from before COVID to during the lockdown. In fact, some of our numbers, so our mean scores, didn't change at all. They were identical. And in part, it could be because our sample was slightly different. A lot of students went home and they weren't checking their Western email, and so they weren't aware that our study was happening. But overall, our samples were fairly similar. The reason we truly think the smartphone addiction and the anxiety hasn't gone up is because people weren't actually perceiving themselves as being so reliant on their phones. This was rather like a normal extension of their daily life. And so this behavior wasn't something out of the ordinary for them. They were already using their phones quite a bit for pretty much everything in their lives, and they continued to do so, maybe to a greater extent, but to them it was still some variation of the norm.
So you mentioned that, you know, people didn't perceive that they were more addicted, and that kind of the results didn't sort of balloon as COVID ballooned. Mm-hmm. Do you think that perhaps one of the reasons for this plateau might also be that with COVID, people are becoming a little bit more going outdoors more, doing more things in nature, maybe trying to disengage a little bit? I know that that's certainly something that I've seen happening.
It's interesting you bring this up, because if we look at data coming from the individual companies and the individual apps like WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, there's a surge of usage. So we actually see almost in real time that usage has gone up by sometimes up to like 76%, 125% for Facebook. So people are definitely using their phones more. They just don't seem to really feel conflicted or bad about it.
And I guess in some ways, maybe it's a good thing, because if they're using their phones, like we've said, to connect through Facebook, WhatsApp, etc., it means they're not connecting in person, and we're avoiding those large gatherings, which we've been asked to do.
Exactly. And this actually leads to one of sort of thoughts that we had as we were looking at the data, is that maybe our dependence on smartphones isn't an addiction at all. Maybe it's not necessarily a bad thing at all. It's just a new way of communicating. Our lives are changing, and the way that we conduct ourselves is changing. And for example, nobody says that people are addicted to their cars, right? Mm-hmm. Cars have just become integrated into daily life, and people rely on them for groceries and to get to work. So maybe smartphones are kind of similar to cars, where now we rely on them to connect with people that are a couple of cities away from us. We rely on them to get groceries or to get dinner, right?
You've mentioned something that I want to pick up on. You mentioned work, and I thought about this as you were mentioning kind of how our cars are what we used to use to get to work, but now we're all working from home. And so do you think that even though the smartphone use has sort of stayed the same, or not risen at least, do you think part of the reason that some of these apps are seeing an increase in usage is people are working from home, telecommuting?
Some of the, sorry, my dogs are fighting in the background.
No worries.
One of the joys of working from home, definitely. I think for me personally, I've started using Instagram, using in the very loose sense, scrolling through Instagram quite a bit since we started working from home, because it's simply there. And even when I'm in meetings, I'm ashamed to say this, but even when I'm in a Zoom meeting, I have the opportunity to sometimes sneak a peek at Facebook or Instagram or some messages coming in. Whereas if this was done in person, there would be like no way I could do that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think about myself, I've used WhatsApp for a couple of meetings, so I know people now are working at home. There's less reliance, of course, on going into an office, so we're telecommuting, and maybe things like WhatsApp, and to some extent, perhaps even Facebook Messenger. I'm wondering if those are apps now used in the work world, which is why we're kind of seeing that increase in data from those apps.
I think you're right. I've definitely used Facebook Messenger to contact the PIs on a few projects, because it was just faster that way. I think another reason is that since we are working from home, there isn't such a clear end of the workday. And so when people are receiving emails at 10 o'clock at night, they're much more willing to answer them, especially if they're coming through notifications on their phones. And work just tends to spill over into leisure time.
Yeah, absolutely. You've talked a little bit about your research. Why did you want to get involved with this project? What was sort of the impetus for you jumping on board and looking at this trend of smartphone addiction?
I think it was my own usage. It was seeing the number of hours spent on social media apps on my phone, and sort of seeing that number climb higher and higher and higher, and feeling like I couldn't leave my phone, screen down at any point. That made me think, this can't be normal. Like, most people can't be feeling this way. Having these phantom vibrations when you have your phone in your purse, or thinking you're getting notifications when you're really not. And so I started looking into the literature, and I noticed that most studies looking at smartphone addiction are actually not from North America. And so They're from Asia. There are a few from the Middle East and a few from Europe, but especially in Canada, there wasn't a single study. And so there was this opportunity to kind of be the first and see whether smartphone addiction, smartphone related anxiety was an issue specifically in post-secondary students because they are the largest consumer base. Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned smartphone anxiety. So would that be the idea that if you don't have your phone or your Apple Watch or your Echo Dot, that you're feeling this sort of panic or anxiousness? I certainly know that's how I feel if the internet's down for even an hour at my place.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the fancy word for smartphone related anxiety is nomophobia. And it's the phobia of either not having service on your phone or not having access to your phone. And what you described is a facet of nomophobia, which is losing connectedness. And people usually experience anxiety related to losing connectedness when they don't have service or their data is not working. And so they feel that someone might be contacting them and they won't be able to receive the message.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think we're feeling that anxiety? Embracing, oh, it's kind of nice not to be contacted for an hour or two.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think, in my personal opinion, is because we have created a culture where we demand instantaneous gratification. And whether it's asking something of our friends, we expect them to reply right away. Or if we're asking something from our coworkers, we're asking them to complete a task. There's the expectation that it will be done immediately. And when we create this expectation and we hold it for long enough, it becomes the norm. I know for myself, if I receive an email and it doesn't matter what the time is, as long as it takes less than 5 minutes to reply to it, I will drop everything and I will reply to that email, even if it's outside of the work hours.
Don't get an Apple Watch because then it's like right on your wrist.
I survived. I actually tried using an Apple Watch because that's the kind of person I am. And I survived a day and my anxiety just skyrocketed because I was getting notifications, but I was away from my computer, so I couldn't reply to the email like extensively. And I couldn't deal with that dissonance knowing that somebody asked me to do something and not being able to complete the task right away.
Absolutely. So, I mean, takeaways, what are you hoping are some implications for the findings, some takeaways from this really important and frankly very timely research?
So the plan is to actually repeat the exact same questionnaire 6 months after the physical distancing kind of guidelines and mandates have been lifted to see if people will return back to the pre-COVID levels. So to see if the way we use our phones and the way we communicate is going to go back to our pre-COVID normal, whatever that was.
Right.
Yes, so that's coming in January, so stay tuned for that.
I certainly will. This is really exciting. Anna, thank you so much for sharing your research with us today and a little bit about your interest in nomophobia. That's a new one for me. You've been listening to Gradcast.
All right, and welcome back to Gradcast, where we are now joined with Yoah. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you guys doing?
We're good. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. So with this episode, since we are talking about how COVID has affected our work, and your situation's a bit different from everyone else, like, 'cause you were a grad student, but you've recently become a postdoc.
That's right. Yeah. So I defended my doctorate at the end of August of this year. And then I've had to kind of maneuver my way into this postdoc position that's starting in January, that's out on the West Coast. And so there's definitely been some logistics and some changes that have happened due to COVID that I'd be happy to talk about.
Yeah, tell us about that experience of sort of deciding, first of all, the applying and then the waiting and the whole idea behind, whether you're going to go or not, and how COVID sort of wreaked havoc or didn't with that whole process?
No, great question. So I'm sure, as a lot of doctoral students know, the postdoc application process starts, well in advance of you defending your doctorate. And so, in September of last year, I started looking into and applying to these different postdoc opportunities with professors that I had gone in touch with. And one of them was in Australia, actually. And so that was a tri-council one. And then the other one I applied to was with a professor out at the University of Victoria. And so, I had applied to these things, January rolls around, and then we're approaching into March, and it's kind of starting to get a little bit dicey with, COVID and restrictions. And I eventually, things start to shut down. And I'm starting to wonder to myself, like, even if I do end up being able to get one of these postdocs out in Australia or even out West, am I going to be able to go there? So that was a little bit of an unknown situation. And then I had talked a little bit more with the professor at UVic, and we had just chatted about writing a different postdoc. So this one was a MyTax, and it's an industry-funded postdoc. So we're working with Participaction, sort of not-for-profit in Canada, and yeah. So we had discussed like the logistics of how do we start that if we want to do that, and originally we had intended on starting it in September. But the current situation is we've decided to postpone it to January. And actually the first 4 months of that MyTax, I'll actually still be here in Ontario. So one of the interesting things about the COVID situation I found is that a lot of organizations and a lot of universities have been more accommodating as far as distance sort of learning, distance work. And so being, where previously living here for 4 months and doing my postdoc across the country might have been a little bit maybe less acceptable, I feel like now much more so. It's very understandable. My still postdoc supervisor is all but willing to accommodate me spending 4 months here and then going over there. So that's definitely changed, I think, for the better in a way. But
why do you say that it's changed for the better?
I mean, when you're able to do some of this work distance, it makes the process a lot, it's a lot logistically less stressful. So I don't have to like go over there first to start things off. I can get some of the groundwork started here and then kind of hit the ground running when I do move over there. But also I feel like it's a lot more accommodating. So, not just for me, but for other individuals who may be starting a postdoc or starting some position, if they're in a, maybe financially or, for maybe health concerns, not able to go to wherever they need to go to complete this work, they don't necessarily have to. A lot of the work can just be done where they're comfortable.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting time to be making plans and trying to think about how those plans are going to actually unfold. What is something maybe you've learned through this whole process of trying to plan, apply, decide where you're going to live, where you're going to study?
No, fantastic question. And you're totally right in that things are kind of, everyone says we live in these, quote unquote, unprecedented times, right? But in a way, it's true. Like, I think the biggest thing is just being adaptable, right? Being able to kind of take in the situation as it comes and, not necessarily get really tied down to one idea of what a particular, doctorate or postdoc or whatever it is position happens to look like. Because, the world is changing kind of, week by week. I mean, the American election is like next week. So the world's going to change yet again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So just being adaptable, I would say.
Yeah. So I guess when you were trying to adapt to the very unprepared situation the world was for the world, what was probably the biggest obstacle you had to face? At least for you personally, what do you think was the hardest thing you had to adapt to? I'm guessing thinking about location must have been pretty big. Yeah,
definitely like logistics, trying to figure out, how a move is going to work during, a time of travel restrictions and health concerns. But also I think financially it's been interesting because, as much as I do have this position that is starting in January, In the meantime, I'm more or less unemployed, still doing a lot of research, quote unquote, but certainly not, the income is something that I'm cognizant of, and just trying to make sure that I can manage so that I can afford to move out there.
Yeah. We're hearing in these times when the labs closed and folks whose research was reliant on labs were kind of stuck at home doing maybe writing up findings or lit reviews, the things really took a hit. Has that been the case for you in terms of your research productivity?
Honestly, and sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of a black sheep for saying this, but I gotta say the pandemic has been really good for my research. And I say that because my research program deals with, physical activity and deals with behavior change. And the pandemic has really offered what has been a worldwide natural experiment in a way. And so being able to look at some of these interesting questions, like, how are people adapting their physical activity, what's happening at these physical activity rates, but also looking at other things like, behavior change that's happening. It's really spawned a lot of projects, and it's also just been a really relevant area for obvious reasons. And so that has kind of helped keep me afloat as far as my research productivity throughout this time. I hesitate in calling COVID-19 a good thing, because I think, overall, I don't think anyone would agree that it is. But in this specific context, like I've been fortunate to have the opportunity and the collaborators to be able to capitalize on this kind of, like I said, natural sort of experiment. So in that way, I guess it's good.
Yeah, it is great when you have collaborators and supervisors who are quite understanding about the entire situation. So we're trying to, I say, if we go towards like motivation for like COVID does make it hard to stay focused on work. We're easily distracted now because there's a lot of things we used to do that we just can't, at least not do the same way that we could maybe a year ago. So what's probably been the number one thing you've been able to do to keep yourself motivated given the situation that you found yourself in?
Yeah, no, again, another great question. From the period of March until August, it was defending, because I still had to write all of my thesis, all of my dissertation together, so that I could, defend it, still on time, which was actually another source of sort of stress, right? Just knowing, I'm not going to be able to defend in person, which has kind of been my expectation for the last 3.5 years. So what's that going to look like? Am I going to be able to defend with the sort of research that I have? One of the projects that was funded and was part of my research program, we didn't end up having the time to run, because obviously we need human participants, and the university is more or less shut down for that kind of thing. And so that more or less was motivating. That, in addition to the fact that postdoc applications, continue well into sort of September and October. And so really it's deadlines. To distill it down to one answer, it's kind of just been deadlines. There is certainly an amount of sort of internal motivation that I have, to want to still succeed and to do well. But I will absolutely agree with you in that there have certainly been moments where I've like stopped and just been like, wow, I'm burning out. I am feeling not very motivated. I'm evaluating, why I'm doing what I'm doing and how I'm working as hard as I'm working. So yeah, it's not always been this nice, like, yeah, hoorah, let's go sort of thing.
Do you think because of COVID, you mentioned that your research really looks at physical activity and participation. Do you think because of COVID, people are more active because we're encouraged to, of course, socially distance, but to get outdoors, to do those hikes in nature? What do you think?
It's a really interesting point you raise. I would say that it depends on who you ask. As a whole, given that for the most part, physical activity is for many people already a difficult behavior to try and perform. It depends on a lot of factors. One is like how well you think you can do it. Two is the environment in which you present yourself in, and the opportunity that you give yourself to be physically active. For a lot of us, this has meant, being at home predominantly and some people, I think, have turned to these online fitness videos as kind of a way to still stay physically active. And one of the projects that we had run with my supervisor out west, my postdoc supervisor, is we looked at these online fitness videos and we were seeing, okay, there's obviously this resurgence of viewership and engagement with these videos closer to the beginning of the pandemic, sort of around March. But what does the pattern of engagement look like over the course of the summer, right? Like, are people watching these consistently, or what does that pattern look like? And when we looked at it, we found that within the first week, that's usually when you saw, regardless of the channel, regardless of, the type of video, that's when you had the most viewership and the most engagement. And then very quickly, within the next week, you had this massive drop in engagement. So we're talking views, likes, comments on videos, new videos. And so more or less, we see the same principle happening with online videos that we do with sort of new gym goers, where people are really motivated at first, but without any sort of external motivational strategies or behavioral strategies, people just drop off very, very quickly. Now, that being said, I was also reading an interesting article the other day in The Guardian talking about how some people have really thrived and flourished as far as physical activity goes under the pandemic. For many, because it is a very stressful situation or event, it's kind of akin to sometimes trauma related to health gives us new motivation to be more health-centric, right? And so it's talking about these people who, realized that they were eating very poorly and they, were very concerned about their health all of a sudden. It was very salient to them. And so they were being, started becoming physically active, and they were using these resources available to them to be more physically active. And so while they exist, I think that those are more few and far between than the average, which is you're at home. Why not sit down on the couch and watch Netflix?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I imagine that Netflix probably got a boost in views and sales ever since.
They did. Yeah, they actually did.
Yeah, and then with Disney Plus that came out, Amazon Prime.
Yeah, all the streaming services.
Because I think, speaking of Disney Plus, because I'm pretty sure today The Mandalorian season 2 premiered.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
There's probably going to be a lot of new Baby Yoda coming out.
I was a big fan of a lot of these streaming services. I was watching The Boys on Amazon Prime when it was coming out. That was really fun. I really like that show.
I've got a friend who was obsessed. He's obsessed with the show. I haven't seen it yet.
It's good. That's good.
But Yoah, I wanted to thank you again for coming on and talking about your experience from a postdoc perspective as well, which I think would be pretty good for graduate students listening that are probably close to defending, or maybe have also started a postdoc when this all happened. So I hope they can learn something from your experience.
Yeah, I hope so as well. Thanks for having me.
And best of luck.
Thank you again.